Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken with US President Donald Trump by phone to review the recent developments in the Ukraine conflict. President Trump has signed a proclamation to restrict travel from several countries, citing national security concerns. And many European countries racing to secure their drinking water supply as climate change intensifies and water resources shrink. We begin with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin has discussed the latest developments in the conflict with Ukraine in a phone call with his US counterpart, Donald Trump. Kremlin foreign policy aide Yuri Ushakov says Putin and Trump talked about Ukrainian attacks on Russian civilians and a second round of negotiations between the two countries. Putin said he would have to respond to Ukraine's far-reaching drone attacks on Russia's strategic air bases. Trump said his conversation with Putin was good, but added it would not lead to immediate peace. Putin has expressed doubt about Ukraine's desire for peace. He accused Kyiv of a bomb attack in Russia that killed 7 people and injured over 100 others only days before their latest talks in Turkey. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the two sides have agreed on another prisoner exchange on the weekend. Dasha Chinishova has more from Moscow.
Several acts of terrorism, as Moscow describes it, committed by the Ukrainian side, including the attacks against the civilian infrastructure in the Russian Bryansk and Kursk region, which have indeed been labeled as acts of terrorism. And we are hearing once again the Russian president holding a meeting with his members of the Security Council and saying that the sponsors of Kyiv are actually accomplices of the terrorists because, again, Moscow believes those were the acts of terrorism committed against the civilian population. And the goal, Moscow suggests, is to derail the negotiations that Moscow and Kyiv have just recently resumed. Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, has also been providing some comments suggesting that Kyiv is trying to derail those negotiations by provoking Moscow to respond. But he said that all means, including the talks, should be here used, and Moscow should not be falling for those provocations on the part of Kyiv. So as things stand now, we understand Moscow is looking into the possible response to those provocative actions by Kyiv. But at the same time, Moscow is very cautious, trying to get the dialogue going. We also hear in the Russian top negotiator Vladimir Medinsky providing his statement and suggesting that the ball is now in Ukraine's court. Russia has handed over its memorandum of the draft peace settlement in Ukraine to the Ukrainian side, and they are waiting for the response from Ukrainians. And all in all, in Moscow, there is a very strong understanding that Western countries should not be trying to incite the escalation of this conflict, but instead what should be happening is trying to bring these two sides to the negotiating table without any more military supplies from the West to Ukraine, because Moscow believes that is counterproductive.
That was Dasha Chinishova reporting. In the Americas, the US President Donald Trump has signed a proclamation to ban travel from certain countries, citing national security risks. The travel ban is scheduled to take effect next Monday. Nick Harper has more.
It looks like the protectionist, isolationist, America First policies are back. Donald Trump making it clear tonight that he is closing the borders to multiple countries. And the travel bans that we saw during his first administration are reappearing. So 12 countries in total are banned from sending any citizens here to the United States, including Afghanistan, Myanmar, Iran and Haiti, while 7 countries face partial travel restrictions, including Laos and Venezuela. The White House is saying this is a common sense restriction that they are putting in place. They're saying that they're doing it to protect Americans from dangerous foreign actors. And remember, this was a campaign promise for Donald Trump. He said that he would reintroduce travel bans if re-elected. For him, this is an opportunity to say promises made, promises kept, and undoubtedly his base, his supporters who voted for him, will love the fact that he is reintroducing these policies. We saw similar policies back in 2017. At the time, they were called the Muslim travel ban because initially they targeted 5 Muslim-majority countries. That travel ban was then extended to an extra 3 countries, including North Korea, Venezuela and Chad in Africa. Here we have, with this new policy, a much larger, more expanded, perhaps even more robust travel plan. But it is likely to face legal challenges. Last time round, during his first presidency, his travel bans face multiple legal challenges. It went all the way to the nation's highest court, the Supreme Court, who ultimately ruled in Donald Trump's favour, allowing the travel ban to stand. We will likely see other challenges in the coming hours and days. But bear in mind, this is a real reversal for the US government. Just a few months ago, under President Joe Biden, the US was welcoming in people from many of these countries who are on the list, including Afghanistan. Afghan refugees were being welcomed into the US. Now Donald Trump is closing the doors and making it very clear there are certain people around the world who are no longer welcome in the United States.
That was Nick Harper reporting. Staying in the US, the Congressional Budget Office has warned of higher costs of consumer and capital goods and a fall in the country's economic output as the Trump administration doubled its tariffs on steel and aluminium imports. Owen Fairclough has more from Washington, D.C.
US consumers are already facing soaring vehicle prices this summer due to tariffs, and they're about to rise even more. President Donald Trump's doubling of 25% protectionist duties on imported aluminium and steel taking effect this Wednesday. Those duties are worldwide, with some exceptions. The biggest exporters to the US and those most impacted include Canada, Mexico and the European Union, the latter baffled by Trump's rationale.
We are exporting highly specialized steel, which is needed for U.S. industry because it's used for specialized production. And we clearly have the same challenge. We are suffering because of the global overcapacity.
Around a quarter of all steel used in the US is imported, so these latest tariffs aimed at safeguarding domestic manufacturing reach far beyond the auto industry. But US steel workers aren't complaining.
The best and strongest steel on earth will forever be made in America and made in Pennsylvania.
Trump visited their heartland last week to announce these tariffs and offer a Japanese investment lifeline to a sector eroded partly by cheaper steel imports. These tariffs took effect on the same day the Trump administration set a deadline for trade partners to submit their proposals for revised deals aimed at scaling back duties. And if many partners are both shaken and stirred by this latest escalation in a trade war, at least 007's favoured car brand Aston Martin has had an escape of sorts. The iconic car maker's native UK allowed to pay merely the original 25% duty on its steel exports and hoping to pay even lower duties on all exports to the US once a bilateral trade deal is finalised.
That was Owen Fairclough reporting from Washington. Turning to Africa, the United Nations says an attack on a humanitarian aid convoy in Sudan has killed 5 people. The convoy was reaching the besieged city of Al-Fasher when the attack took place. UN agencies delivering the aid say the attackers burned many trucks. Crystal Ankil has more.
The Monday attack took place in North Darfur, where aid workers say over 1 million people are on the brink of starvation. It is the latest assault on aid in a country gripped by what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The convoy, made up of trucks from the UN Child's Agency and the World Food Programme, was near Al-Koma, waiting for approval to proceed to El Fasher.
5 members of a UN humanitarian convoy were killed last night, and several more were injured during an attack near Al-Koma in North Darfur. I can tell you that we, of course, condemn in the strongest possible terms this horrendous act of violence against humanitarian personnel who literally put their lives at risk in an attempt to reach vulnerable children and families in the famine-impacted areas of Sudan.
Although the UN did not say who was responsible, Sudan's warring sides traded blame over the attack. The army-aligned government said RSF drones targeted the trucks, while the paramilitary group accused the army of carrying out the attack with a military aircraft.
The route that the convoy was going to take was shared in advance with the parties on the ground who were notified and aware of the location of the trucks. Multiple of our trucks were burnt in the attack and critical humanitarian supplies were damaged. This is devastating that the supplies have not reached the civilians in need. This was the first UN humanitarian convoy that was going to make it to El Fasher in over 1 year.
Both the army and RSF have been accused of using starvation as a weapon of war and looting or obstructing aid. Nearly half the population, or 25 million people, are facing extreme levels of hunger, according to the UN, which last year confirmed famine in 5 areas across Sudan.
That was Crystal Ankil reporting. Finally, in Europe, Thursday marks the 54th World Environment Day. The focus this year is on solutions for plastic pollution. Many European countries are racing to secure their drinking water supply as climate change intensifies and water resources shrink. From small villages to major cities, local initiatives and EU policy debates are shaping the continent's response to one of its most urgent environmental challenges. Johannes Pleschberger has more from a village in Austria.
Across the EU, member states are trying to find new ways to tackle the dwindling water supply. The Austrian village of Reisenberg is installing a chemical-free natural filtration plant, which aims at transforming a previously unsuited water source into fresh drinking water.
Our summers get hotter and drier, and so we have to use every resource, every drinking water resource for our consumers.
Meanwhile, Vienna started construction on what is said to be the world's largest drinking water tank. Projects like these can ensure there's enough drinking water, but they don't tackle the source of the problem. In Europe, high population density and the over-extraction of natural water sources are leading to shortages, which the European Environment Agency says affect around a third of the EU. Previous to the presentation of the bloc's new water strategy, the European Parliament urged the responsible commissioner to introduce water extraction targets based on risk assessments.
We need to know the quantity of water that we have and hence how much water we are using. That is why the Parliament is calling for water efficiency and abstraction targets across the EU.
For the past 25 years, the EU has regulated its fresh water via the Water Framework Directive, which member states, however, failed to comply with. Only about a quarter of EU surface water bodies reach required purity levels.
The big step is upcoming. The Water Framework Directive officially ends by 2027. And as the targets are not fulfilled to this date, it will be interesting how this will be managed in the future.
As long as EU targets are not fully enforced, it is often up to local initiatives to ensure there's enough drinking water, something that's becoming increasingly difficult given rising temperatures and melting glaciers.
That was Johannes Pleschberger reporting. Now recapping the headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken with US President Donald Trump by phone to review the recent developments in the Ukraine conflict. President Trump has signed a proclamation to restrict travel from several countries, citing national security concerns. And many European countries are racing to secure their drinking water supply as climate change intensifies and water resources shrink. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.